Please welcome back Steve Clemons, editor-at-large at Semafor, to lead a discussion on U.S.-China relations.
I say, surprise, I'm back. Bob, have a seat here. Jake, have a seat there. And I think joining us, we've got Robert O'Brien. Robert, it's great to see you. We wish you were here with us. I don't know if you're in California, Oklahoma. Where are you right now?
Out in Los Angeles. Greetings from the West Coast.
Well, excellent, excellent. Well, let me tell you, we've got a fantastic panel here. Just to my right, we have Ambassador Robert Kimmitt. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Germany, but particularly to this, he was the former Deputy Treasury Secretary under President Bush, if I may recall correctly. I think GW, right?
GW.
GW, okay, got to get those straight. And then we have Representative Jake Auchincloss. I want to say a special thanks to Jake from Massachusetts, who's a member of the House Select Committee on China, recently in Taiwan. He flew in specifically, as I mentioned earlier, Congress is not in session now. So to actually have a living human being from the U.S. Congress, U.S. Senator, we did Mark Warner a little while ago by virtual. So Jake, thank you so much for coming down here. And then just over my left, we have Ambassador Robert O'Brien. Of course, he was the former National Security Advisor to President Trump. I should also say, I think that the title, right, because it's relevant to some of the other things going on in the world. We're not going to get it. But Robert used to handle hostage affairs in the Department of State. Was a special envoy in hostage affairs, which seems to be becoming a mini industry in the world with some things going on. So I want to thank Robert for that. Look, our conversation today was really inspired by our co-chairman of this conference, Laura Tyson, Michael Strain, Jason Furman, Bob Kimmitt, helped me put this conference together and allowed me to drop their name to get all sort of speakers here. So I want to thank you so much. But in the conversation, there are different dimensions in the U.S.-China relationship and where we're headed. And so we titled this provocatively, From Strategic Economic Dialogue to S.O.S. ? And so I want to just start out with Bob here for a minute. Bob, you may be the only person I know, and I knew your father, which is a weird thing for me to say, but your father was very important in my life. But he won a Silver Star in the Korean fighting the Chinese. You yourself were wounded in Vietnam by a mortar shell manufacturer. You know, China's a big deal in your family on some tough situations. You were in the NSC staff during normalization with China. You traveled to China with Ronald Reagan in 1984. Then you became Deputy Secretary of the Treasury when the Strategic Economic Dialogue was established. In fact, you work real closely with Hank Paulson, who's a friend of a lot of folks in this conference. But can I ask you now to lay the foundation for this discussion?
Steve, gladly. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity to help pull together what we hope will be the first of many of these conferences. I think it's terrific. It's during the IMF World Bank meetings when we have so many people from the economic financial world coming to town, and great that later programs talk about the economic and financial component of national security. I happen to think they're the growth areas also in the U.S.-China relationship. As I thought about this, it struck me that over the past 90 years, and I won't go too long, there's been a sort of 17-year circadian dimension to Chinese-American relations. So 17 years after.
Those cute little bugs that fly around and
cicadas, at least around here, pop up every 17 years. Well, 17 years after the Long March, we were at war with China in Korea.
Right.
17 years after that, we were preparing for the historic visit of Nixon to China. 17 years after Nixon's visit to China, Tiananmen Square. The depths of China's relations, both with the U.S., many else in the world. And then 17 years later, we've got the strategic economic dialogue with China, first meeting in Beijing in December of 2006. Interestingly, just to show how times have changed, 2 months before, in October of 2006, China joined the U.S. at the UN in voting for the first of 9 sanctions resolutions against North Korea because of its nuclear program. So there was both a strategic and an economic.
You helped on that, I think.
I had a lot to do with it, but a lot of people at State, the White House, and Treasury helped. We did the same thing with Iran, 6 resolutions on Iran, again, with both the Chinese and the Russians voting with us at that time. And then all of a sudden, here we are 17 years later to a point, I think, that mimics where we were on June 4th, '89 during Tiananmen Square. Chinese-American relations are at a low ebb. I think China today unites Republicans and Democrats, House, Senate, Congress, and the White House in a way that we didn't see against the Soviet Union in the darkest days of the Cold War. Interestingly, we had no economic relationship with the Soviet Union. We have a very important economic relationship with China, but nonetheless, we have today everything from the Select Committee to the work of the standing committees to the work of the administration, and by the way, allies, most of our allies around the world are doing to try to send a message to China that we're prepared to compete.
Right.
But we need to compete on the basis of an agreed set of rules, a level playing field. To me, the interesting thing about this conference and the look ahead is where are we going to be 17 years from now? We're going to be approaching our 5th presidential election in that 17-year period, and China may be ruled by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, 17 years from now, will only be 2 years older than Deng Xiaoping was when he turned over supreme leadership of China, and he'll be 6 years younger than Deng Xiaoping was when he died. They'll be 10 years away from 2050. And I think the question will be, how close will they be to achieving their goal of being the dominant force in the world by no later than 2050? And what will we have done, both ourselves and our allies, to compete with China in a way that advances our interests, but also maintains peace and security, not only in the Taiwan Straits, but the region and globally?
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for setting that stage. Representative Auchincloss and, say to Ambassador O'Brien, one of the, questions I have out there was set in place by a guy, I can't mention his name, but I can say he was a senior member of the Biden administration. We had a dinner one night, and it was about internet geopolitics. It was looking at, IT and kind of what was going on. And this guy is a hawk. I mean, he's a real hard-hitting hawk concerned about different dimensions of China. But he said, there are areas we need to de-risk our relationship, but we also have to realize that China is integrated so deeply with the United States. The levels of trade are so huge. We have to figure out what we have to fight to still have there, that we can't just be looking at one side of the equation. So as in your role on the Select Committee on China, and you visited Taiwan, you've been having hearings, and to be candid, I've been impressed with the absence of cheap shots by either side in the committee right now. How are you balancing those two different dimensions of a hugely profound, deep, embedded relationship between the U.S. and China, and a lot of talk about decoupling?
Yeah. First of all, just on the committee real fast, this is a hand-picked select committee, relatively small, and really charted with rising above day-to-day politics and trying to think about long-term strategy vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party. And it's easy to see why Speaker Kevin McCarthy wanted to do this. This is likely to be something that he can point to as an accomplishment in the 118th Congress, where there may be a few other accomplishments. But I think Hakeem Jeffries deserves a lot of credit for keep creating the space for it to be bipartisan from the very beginning. I mean, Hakeem and Kevin sat down together with the members of the committee and said, if you all want to fight, there's other committees to go to. This committee is about getting work done. And I think Hakeem's willingness to provide that oxygen is really a testament to his statesmanship. And so far, as you said, the committee is doing that work and doing it without cheap shots. The question in terms of how do we think about de-risking, decoupling, divesting, to me, it's got to start backwards from scenarios as opposed to forwards from technology. It's easy to say AI, semiconductors, biopharma, food, textiles. These are areas that we have to make sure that we're divest or de-risked. But it doesn't tell you how much leverage the CCP would have over the United States at certain conflict points. I'd rather work backwards and say, let's map out the 5 to 10 most likely scenarios of the CCP versus the United States in the Indo-Pacific, where there could be tension, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, et cetera, and then figure out what leverage they would have over us and how do we de-risk that leverage. So the analogy for us with Ukraine and Russia would have been to say 5 years ago, hey, Germany, relying on Russia for all your natural gas is a bad idea. Right. De-risk that. So let's forward think now about what are those same choke points that China might have over the United States in future conflict points, as opposed to trying to work forwards from technology.
Robert, you and I did an interview recently about a potential invasion of Taiwan, you made the interesting point that if China were successful, that the crown jewels of the world semiconductor industry wouldn't survive that they would be so-called taken care of, kind of like Winston Churchill took care of the French fleet, keeping it from falling into the hands of the Nazis. And it created quite a stir. But I guess my question to you, as you have studied and you know much more about, where we are in potential kinetic conflict over various issues. I mean, how are you seeing, are we on a collision course, to go to Graham Allison's Thucydides trap that we can't get out of? Is there a constructive way in which we both hold our heads up high and avoid the collision course, or should we just plan for it?
Well, I think what you're seeing is in the U.S. military, there's a growing recognition that what China is preparing for now is not just an amphibious assault against Taiwan and taking Taiwan back. They're building a military that can dominate the world, that'll have global power, and that they'll be the preeminent military power, along with being the preeminent economic and diplomatic power. So I think we need to prepare for a China that's going to become even more aggressive than they have been. And we see China just in their own region. We see conflicts with India on the border, on the line of actual control. We see the South China Sea being totally militarized against all representations that have been made to President Obama. We've seen democracy extinguished in Taiwan. We see the genocide in Xinjiang. People on the left used to care about Tibet and the Dalai Lama. That's no longer as exciting for them anymore, I think, because of China's influence in Hollywood. We've got the threats against Taiwan, but it's greater than that. We've got China acting in every region of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, certainly in Europe. So they're relentless, they're hardworking, they're clever, and they're going to challenge us everywhere. And I think our military is starting to understand that this is an area where we may come to blows, and maybe sooner rather than later. It depends on how vainglorious Xi is and how his ambition is going to drive him. I mean, this is not a Chinese leader that, like Deng or others, that wanted to hide and abide and were willing to put their personal glory and their personal victories aside for the greater good of China and the longer run. This is someone who wants to realize ambitions during his lifetime. And as Bob pointed out, he may have 17 or 20 more years in power. And I think he wants Taiwan back, and I think that will spur a greater conflict with the United States. President Biden has said 4 times now that he'll defend Taiwan with force. He was walked back by Jake and others the first 3 times. I never knew how that quite worked, because if I would have tried to walk back President Trump 3 times, I wouldn't have lasted to the 3rd time. But on the 4th time, they didn't walk him back, and I think that's now U.S. policy. So, we've got General Minahan telling his troops to get their wills and trusts in order. We've got Admiral Gilday talking about the Davidson window being shrunk down to maybe 1 or 2 years. So I think it's something we have to be prepared for. But I'll finish up by answering the second part of your question was, can we avoid it? And I'm not sure if Graham is right with his the Thucydides trap. I think we can avoid it, and I think the way to avoid it is through American leadership and through the whole doctrine of someone I was an intern for and that Ambassador Kimmitt worked for is Ronald Reagan, and that's peace through strength. So if we can get the hypersonics deployed, if we can get our military rebuilt, if we can get the industrial base where it needs to be, if we can get the Navy rebuilt, get our aircraft maintained, and keep building the 5th and now 6th generation aircraft that we need, the B-21s on the bomber front, I think we can present a risk to China that even Xi, right, with all of his ambition, will be careful to avoid. Taking the risk.
Let me ask you a quick question, follow-up, and then I'm going to get back to Deputy Secretary Kimmitt. I think you would not disagree with me if I characterized President Trump's relationship with Xi Jinping as somewhat schizophrenic. Some days best pals, other days, rival and spitting at each other. If President Trump comes back, which way do you think? I mean, do you think that that White House, which I tell President Trump kind of sidestep a lot of hard-hitting challenges, prides himself on not being the war president, et cetera. Do you think that sidestepping conflict with China or sending that signal helps or hurts?
Well, look, I think strong American leadership deters China, and the Chinese weren't going to invade Taiwan while President Trump was president. They weren't going to cross them, just like Russia didn't invade Ukraine, and just like we didn't have another new war. And that goes back to the Ronald Reagan years. That was 8 years during Reagan, where other than Grenada, which was more of a hostage rescue of the medical students than a full-fledged invasion and occupation of a country, we didn't have war for 8 years, and because peace through strength works. Now, President Trump was always cordial. You talk about his relationship. He was always cordial with world leaders, whether they were friendly or foes. He always had nice conversations with them on the phone. He thought that was the way to do diplomacy.
Right.
But there were tough actions. We took, just in the last year and a half of the Trump administration, I think we took 128 different actions against China, and most of those have been kept in place by the Biden administration. I compliment Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and President Biden himself for leaving those tough policies in place. But more needs to be done because the Chinese haven't stopped. They're relentless in their approach to global domination.
I just want to show for the record that Ambassador Robert O'Brien just complimented President Biden and team. But anyway, Jake, you want to jump in real quick?
I got to jump in there because let me be crystal clear here. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are salivating at the prospect of President Trump re-entering the White House in 2025. Okay, January 6, 2021 was Xi Jinping's best day in office because when the United States degrades its own democracy on the world stage for people the world over to witness, it undermines the power of our example. And the power of our example has always been more compelling than the example of our power. I absolutely think the military needs to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. The Marine Corps is leading the way, Semper Fidelis. But we have to think more holistically than that. The United States and the China relationship is more about the United States than it is about China. China's 1.4 billion people. They're talented people. They are going to do great things in terms of science and technology. We're not going to be able to play keep away. What we can do is be a beacon for immigrants. We can defend the rule of law. We can have deep and liquid capital markets. And we can create a global operating system that countries like Mexico and India and Indonesia and Nigeria want to plug into because they see the benefits for themselves.
Right.
That is the vision we need to paint. And Donald Trump in the White House would destroy the very tenets of all of it.
Thank you. Rob,
Bob, I just want to make a point. It's
real quick.
Point, and I appreciate the congressman doing a great job on the committee, and Mike Gallagher's doing a great job leading it. And I appreciate that. But the politics goes both ways. I mean, I've heard from foreign leaders since it's happened that the darkest day for political prisoners around the world is when Alvin Bragg indicted President Trump. I mean, I'm hearing from diplomats from third countries and UN envoys who are saying, how do we go to a dictator and tell him to release the opposition leader that they just jailed, or to release the priest or the missionary or the reporter, when America just indicted the former president and the leading opposition candidate for president?
There is no journalist who thinks that Donald Trump is good for the freedom of the press. Let's be very clear.
We may not like it, but that's just a fact. I mean, that's
it's not.
I mean, we've heard the president of El Salvador saying that publicly. So
thank goodness we have Joe Biden in the White House when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine, because given the Helsinki performance in 2018, Donald Trump is fanboying all over Vladimir Putin as opposed to standing up for American values. So the idea that Donald Trump is good for American competitiveness.
So Semafor thing, I'm going to bring Bob Kimmitt in.
Congressman, the point I'll make is,
I'm going to bring.
Hey, I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Bob Kimmitt in, but let me just ask. One of the things. Yeah, go ahead.
Look, Vladimir Putin did not invade Ukraine when President Trump was president, and he got the 600 javelins, which blunted the attack on Ukraine under the Trump administration, when he got Gatorade and MREs from the Obama-Biden administration. So there is a real difference in hard power. Now, having said that, I've complimented the Biden administration on, after the invasion, after the failure of deterrence, after the catastrophe in Afghanistan that led to the invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration did a good job rallying our allies, and they've done a good job supplying material.
Let the diplomat go, because we're going to keep on going back and forth.
My adrenaline is back. But Bob Kimmitt, let me ask you. I'm going to bring you back here to something a little bit more boring but important. You wrote this foreign affairs article on the importance of Treasury being at the national security table and you anticipated in many ways a while back, and now that has happened, where the Secretary of Treasury has become a statutory member of the National Security Council. Before it was just optional, and you could just exclude him or her if you wanted, but now it's required. But the overlap of economic questions and issues, which is what we're partly talking about here today, and national security ones. And we have the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Policy, Mike Powell, coming on later to talk exactly about this issue, in part inspired by this. But as we talk about this and we wrestle through it, the thing that's getting at me, that gnawing me, at one level it sounds good and smart, and the other level, I don't know if America's good at that. I really don't know if America and the ecosystem here and business and private sector is, to a certain degree, you're saying that political and national security preferences should inform the way markets and economics work, right?
I was with you until the last sentence.
Yeah.
Look,
Pat Malloy was too.
No, I'm a big believer in the markets. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a Ronald Reagan traditional conservative. I believe
you used to be a free trade guy. Now you're a fair trade and free trade guy, right?
But look, the world works best on the basis of free and fair trade, flexible exchange rates set in open competitive markets, and the free flow of capital across borders based on open investment policies. Right. But in each of those cases, there's a security dimension. We need a Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. to make sure that investment doesn't hurt U.S. security interests.
Right.
In the trade area, we have to make sure that people who sign on to agreements and belong to organizations like the WTO live up to their obligations. Mm-hmm. And free and flexible exchange rates, you don't hear that said too much in Beijing, right?
Right.
Peg currencies, using it as a weapon. My point is, interestingly, nowhere in the statute books is national security defined. To me, it is the summation of our foreign policy, plus defense policy, plus international economic policy, divided by or resting on a strong intelligence base. Let me just say, I have seen the Chinese for 3 decades integrate those 4 components better than we, because from the start, and really almost out of necessity, they had a clearer grasp of the national security dimensions for them, both at home and abroad, of that economic and financial component. By the way, I think the congressman put it exactly right. Robert picked up on it. Been some good books written recently, included by Dave McCormick, Superpower in Peril, where at the end of the day, yeah, we do have to compete with the Chinese. We have to stand up to what they're doing. But 75% of what we should be doing is getting our own house in order. And McCormick lays out both what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. And some of those are market opportunities and political challenges. So to me, I say that, when I grew up in the Cold War, it was a time of nuclear throw weights measured in kilotonnage. Today, a national security professional needs to know as much about sovereign interest rates measured in basis points.
Right.
And the person who's going to be that good national security professional in the future will be able to intersect those various pieces as well as any of our adversaries or friends do, because we've got to be the leader in the room.
Robert, if you were going to, Ambassador O'Brien, if you're going to fix one thing, and we're right in the minute, this is going to be your last word, and then Jake's last word in a moment. What is the element on our strategic dashboard we collectively need to pay a lot more attention to that rises above all others?
Look, I think underlying what's going on in Ukraine, Taiwan, China right now is that we need to rebuild our defense industrial base. It was robust during the Cold War. We're down to 4 public shipyards. The Chinese have 13. One of their shipyards is bigger than all 4 of ours put together, but it's just not there. We have too many single points of failure. And so we need a strong defense industrial base. I hate the word industrial policy. I'm like Ambassador Kimmitt. I'm for free men and free women and free markets and a traditional Reagan Republican. But we're going to have to use some incentives, and that's where the CHIPS Act came in good stead. And I supported it. Mike Pompeo supported it, even though it was a Biden administration initiative. And we need to do the same thing for chips and industrial manufacturing when it comes to the defense sector. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet our obligations to our own warriors, our own war fighters, but to our friends and allies in places like Ukraine and Taiwan.
Thank you for that. And Representative Auchincloss, when you sort of look at, and I know you were just recently in Taiwan, as I mentioned, you just kind of look at this broad, set of factors and equities, and coming back to this former official's take on it, on what we have to get right, what we have to change, how we have to de-risk. I don't know if there's a good playbook out there, right? So how, I know you're earnestly looking at this, but just as a final word, are you worried about the committee falling into one side of a trap or another? How do you walk the line so at the end of the day, America's equities are preserved and you don't end up producing the next global Great Depression or war?
I think we got to look at three things. Overseas, the relationship with India. Right now, they're importing huge amounts of Russian oil. It's been a huge disappointment that they've undermined the price cap sanctions. They've been historically non-aligned. We want them plugged into the United States operating system, not the CCP's operating system, and they have every reason to be. As a democracy fighting at the Himalayas with the Chinese, they should be on Team America.
But you're worried that they won't be?
I'm worried that they won't be. At the very least, there'll be an aggravating third-party factor. So we got to work on India overseas. Here at home, as I said before, it's rule of law and democracy. If we don't have that, I don't care how clever our strategy is, it just ain't going to work. And then finally, and we haven't talked about this at all, but I will just point to the big tech companies. We have to deal with them in two different ways. One is we've got to protect kids' mental health and the fact that we're in a printing press moment now, where for the first time in 400 years, the entire way that we consume information has been upended. But on the other hand, we have to think of them as strategic assets because they are hubs where three things converge: computing power, quality data, and STEM talent. And that has become a strategic asset that no other nation in the world can compete with us with. So we have to have some kind of public-private partnership in addition to getting tough on them.
Well, with that, we're going to have to end it there. It's a really, really important discussion. We're going to keep at it at Semafor. There are a lot of different dimensions to it. I want to particularly thank Representative Jake Auchincloss for flying down from Massachusetts, being in Washington, D.C., allowing himself to be seen on a day when Congress is not in session. So it's out there. Ambassador Robert Kimmitt, thank you so much for also helping to chair this. And Ambassador Robert O'Brien, thank you for joining us from sunny Los Angeles and giving us your very sober thoughts on the future. Thank you all very much.